When Ethan, a seasoned plumber, uncovers a forgotten chest in the Whittaker family's basement, he unearths long-buried secrets, letters and photographs of an interracial love affair from the family's past. As these hidden truths come to light, the seemingly perfect family begins to unravel, leading to a tense confrontation that forces them to face the consequences of their buried history. Can the Whittakers heal from the past, or will the truth destroy everything they've built? Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now let's dive in. The morning sun filtered through the leaves as Ethan pulled into the driveway of the Whittaker estate, his van humming to a stop. It wasn't the first time he'd been called to a large house like this. As a skilled plumber, Ethan had seen it all: leaks in mansions, minor repairs in tiny apartments. But the grandeur of the Whittaker home still made him pause. The house was an architectural masterpiece, the kind of place where everything seemed perfect on the outside, polished and pristine. Behind the manicured hedges and flawless paint job, though, every house had its problems. Mr. Whittaker greeted him at the door with the kind of forced politeness Ethan had grown accustomed to over the years. He was a tall man in his late 40s, with a well-tailored suit and an air of someone used to being in control. His smile didn't quite reach his eyes, but he extended his hand with practiced warmth. "Ethan, right? Thanks for coming out on short notice," Mr. Whittaker said, his voice steady but brisk. "No problem," Ethan replied, shaking the man's hand. "What seems to be the issue?" "We've got a leak in the basement that's been getting worse over the last few days. My wife noticed some water seeping through the walls." Mr. Whittaker turned, leading Ethan through the grand foyer, past expensive-looking furniture and artwork that probably cost more than Ethan's entire house. "It's probably nothing major, but we'd rather get it taken care of before it causes real damage." Ethan nodded, his eyes briefly scanning the details of the house. It was the kind of place where nothing was out of place. Even the smallest details seemed curated for effect, the kind of home where appearances were everything. "Down here," Mr. Whittaker said, opening a door to the basement. They descended into the dimly lit space, a stark contrast to the bright, airy rooms upstairs. The basement smelled faintly of mildew, the cool air heavy with moisture. It was a storage area more than anything else, with boxes stacked against the walls and old furniture covered in dust. The leak wasn't hard to find. A patch of wetness stained the wall, and Ethan traced the source to a small crack in the pipe that ran along the ceiling. It was a simple fix, nothing that would take more than an hour or two, but as he examined the damage more closely, his gaze drifted to a section of the wall that looked unusual. A portion of the drywall had softened from the water, and as Ethan brushed his fingers over it, part of the wall gave way, revealing something hidden behind it. At first, Ethan thought it was just more old junk stored away like everything else in the basement, but then he saw the edges of an old metal chest, tucked away behind the damaged wall. It looked ancient, covered in dust and rust, the kind of thing that had been forgotten for years, maybe decades. Curiosity tugged at him, but he hesitated. This wasn't what he was here for. He was supposed to fix the leak, not go snooping around in the Whittaker family's secrets. Still, something about the chest called to him. He knelt down, wiping away some of the dust, and gently pried it open. The lock had long since corroded, making it easy to lift the lid. Inside, he found something he didn't expect. Photographs, old, black-and-white pictures, worn and yellowed with age. Beneath the photos were letters, bound together with a ribbon that had faded with time. Ethan hesitated again. This was personal, something clearly meant to be hidden away. But his hand moved almost on its own, picking up one of the letters. The handwriting was elegant, each stroke deliberate and careful. As he read, a story began to unfold, one that spoke of a time long past, a relationship that had clearly been kept secret. The letters told the story of a young black man and a white woman, both deeply in love but bound by the constraints of the world around them. The letters were filled with longing, fear, and hope, with words that painted a picture of two people who had risked everything to be together. Each letter carried a tone of urgency, as if the writer knew that their love would never be accepted in the eyes of society. Ethan set the letter down, his heart pounding. This was no ordinary love story. It was clear that the couple had faced tremendous obstacles, likely from both sides of their racial divide. The photographs showed the man and woman together, standing close, holding hands in some, their smiles bright yet tinged with sadness. It was a kind of love that was both beautiful and tragic. As Ethan sifted through the contents of the chest, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was something he wasn't meant to find. Yet here it was, hidden away behind a wall, a secret locked in the house for decades. Why had it been hidden? And who had put it there? Everything all right down there? Mr. Whittaker's voice echoed from the top of the stairs, pulling Ethan out of his thoughts. "Yeah, just a bit more damage to the wall than I expected," Ethan called back, quickly closing the chest and pushing it back into the gap in the wall. He needed more time to think, to process what he had found, but now wasn't the time to get caught up in it. He had a job to finish. As he continued working on the leak, his mind kept drifting back to the chest, the photographs, and the letters. He couldn't help but wonder what had happened to the couple, how their story had ended. Had they been forced apart? Had they found a way to be together despite the odds? And most importantly, why had their love been buried, both literally and figuratively, beneath the surface of the Whittaker family home? Ethan finished the repair, but the questions lingered long after the last pipe was tightened. As he packed up his tools, he glanced one last time at the wall where the chest was hidden, feeling a strange sense of responsibility. This wasn't just a house with a leaking pipe. It was a house with a story, one that someone had tried very hard to hide. As he left the Whittaker home, his thoughts were heavy with the weight of the past. Whatever had happened here, it wasn't over yet. Ethan had uncovered something that couldn't stay hidden forever. Ethan couldn't stop thinking about the chest he had uncovered in the basement. As he drove home that evening, the discovery weighed heavily on his mind. The photographs and letters, hidden away behind the wall, had stirred something inside him, a mixture of curiosity and unease. He wondered who the couple had been, what they had endured, and why their love had been buried, hidden from the light for so long. It wasn't the first time Ethan had come across old family secrets during his work. Over the years, he had encountered dusty attics filled with forgotten heirlooms, boxes of old letters, and faded photographs. But this was different. This wasn't just a collection of memories. This was a love story that had been deliberately hidden, erased from the family's history. As he settled into bed that night, Ethan found himself replaying the day's events in his mind. The chest, the letters, the photographs, all of it haunted him, as if the past was whispering in his ear, begging to be uncovered. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, it was filled with fragmented dreams of the couple in the photographs. Their faces blurred by time, their love a faint echo from another era. The next day, Ethan returned to the Whittaker home to finish patching the wall. He had already fixed the leak, but the damage to the drywall needed to be repaired. As he pulled into the driveway, he felt a strange sense of anticipation, as if the house itself was waiting for him to uncover more of its secrets. Mrs. Whittaker greeted him this time. She was a slender woman, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her clothes impeccably tailored. There was a coolness to her demeanor, a kind of practiced politeness that Ethan had seen before in people who were used to keeping others at arm's length. "Good morning, Ethan," she said, her voice crisp but not unfriendly. "I hope everything is going smoothly with the repairs." "Morning, Mrs. Whittaker," Ethan replied, nodding. "Everything's fine. I'll just be finishing up the patchwork today." "Excellent," she said, a brief smile flashing across her face. "If you need anything, I'll be upstairs." Ethan watched her disappear down the hallway, her footsteps soft against the polished hardwood floors. He could sense something unspoken in her demeanor, a tension that lingered just beneath the surface. It was subtle, but it was there, an edge of anxiety, as if she was waiting for something to go wrong. He made his way back to the basement, where the air was still thick with the smell of dampness. The chest was still there, hidden behind the drywall he had yet to fully replace. As he worked, his mind wandered back to the letters he had read the day before. The words had stayed with him, lingering in his thoughts like a distant memory. One of the letters had been particularly striking. It was written by the woman, her handwriting delicate but firm, each word chosen with care. She spoke of the love she had for the young black man, how they had met in secret, how they had dreamed of a future together, despite the world that seemed determined to keep them apart. There was a sadness in her words, a sense of inevitability, as if she knew their love could never truly survive in the world they lived in. Ethan felt a pang of empathy as he thought about the couple. They had lived in a time when their love was not only frowned upon, but actively dangerous. The world they had inhabited was one of strict social rules, of lines that were not meant to be crossed. And yet, they had dared to defy those rules, to love each other in spite of everything. As he smoothed the new drywall into place, Ethan's thoughts were interrupted by a soft voice behind him. "Are you fixing the wall?" He turned to see Lily, the Whittaker's youngest daughter, standing at the bottom of the stairs. She was a curious child, with wide blue eyes and a head full of questions. She'd been watching him the day before too, asking him about his tools and how plumbing worked. "Yeah, just finishing up," Ethan said with a smile. "Had a little more damage than expected." Lily nodded, her eyes drifting to the spot where the chest had been hidden. "Did you find anything down here?" Ethan hesitated, unsure how to answer. He didn't want to lie to the child, but he also didn't want to explain the complexities of what he had found. "Just some old junk behind the wall," he said, keeping his tone light. "Nothing too exciting." Lily looked unconvinced, her brow furrowing in thought. "My mom says there are a lot of old things in this house, stuff from our family from a long time ago." "Yeah, I guess there would be in a house this old," Ethan said, continuing his work. "A lot of history in these walls." Lily wandered closer, her eyes still fixed on the wall. "Do you think there are secrets in the house?" Ethan paused, glancing at her. "Secrets?" "Yeah," Lily said, her voice barely a whisper. "Like things people don't want you to know. My mom always says that we have to be careful about what people think of our family. She says that people talk, and we have to make sure they don't say bad things." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. Lily's innocent words carried a weight that she didn't fully understand, a truth that only an adult could grasp. The Whittakers clearly cared about their image, about how they were perceived by the outside world. And if the chest and its contents were any indication, there were things in their past that they had gone to great lengths to hide. "That's a lot for a kid to think about," Ethan said gently. "But I'm sure your family's got nothing to worry about." Lily didn't respond right away, her gaze still locked on the wall. After a moment, she looked up at him, her face serious. "Do you believe in ghosts?" Ethan blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Ghosts?" Lily nodded. "My brother says there's a ghost in the house. He says it's someone from a long time ago, but I think he's just trying to scare me." Ethan chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I don't think you have anything to worry about. No ghosts here." Lily smiled, satisfied with his answer, and skipped back up the stairs, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts once more. As he finished patching the wall, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the house was indeed haunted. Not by ghosts, but by the secrets of its past. The Whittakers might have buried those secrets long ago, but they were still there, just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. And Ethan had a feeling that the truth wouldn't stay hidden for much longer. As the days passed, Ethan found it harder and harder to concentrate on his work. The chest and its contents had taken root in his mind, stirring questions he couldn't ignore. There was something about the Whittaker house, something about the way the family moved through it, as though they were walking on eggshells in their own home, that made him feel like he was witnessing only the surface of a much deeper story. And that story, hidden beneath layers of wealth, respectability, and carefully curated appearances, was starting to unravel before his eyes. He hadn't mentioned the chest to anyone, not even his closest friends or his partner, Maya. It wasn't that he didn't trust them. It was more that he didn't quite know how to explain what he had found, or why it mattered so much to him. There was a weight to the discovery that felt deeply personal, even though the history belonged to someone else. The Whittakers, for their part, seemed unaware of the storm brewing around them. Mr. Whittaker continued with his business as usual, polite but distant, always with his phone in hand and a list of meetings to attend. Mrs. Whittaker, on the other hand, had grown increasingly anxious. Every time Ethan saw her, she seemed on edge, her eyes darting around the house as if she were waiting for something to happen, something that she couldn't control. But it was Adam, the teenage son, who finally tipped the balance. It started on a quiet afternoon. Ethan had returned to the house to finish some final touch-ups in the basement, making sure the repairs were seamless. As he worked, he heard footsteps on the stairs. He assumed it was Mr. Whittaker checking on his progress, but when he turned around, he found Adam standing at the foot of the stairs, watching him with a look of quiet intensity. Adam was tall for his age, with the same blonde hair and blue eyes as his mother, but there was something different about him. Unlike his parents, who seemed determined to maintain a certain image, Adam didn't seem to care about appearances. He was dressed in a worn hoodie and jeans, his hands shoved into his pockets, and his expression was a mix of curiosity and something darker. Something Ethan couldn't quite place. "Hey," Adam said, his voice low. "Hey," Ethan replied, wiping his hands on a rag. "Need something?" Adam hesitated for a moment before stepping closer. "I heard you found something down here." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't told anyone about the chest, at least not directly. But somehow, Adam seemed to know. Maybe he had seen the way Ethan had lingered in the basement that first day, or maybe Lily had mentioned something in passing. Either way, Ethan felt the walls closing in. "Found what?" Ethan asked, keeping his tone light, though his nerves were starting to fray. "Come on, man," Adam said, his eyes narrowing. "You know what I'm talking about. My sister told me you found something behind the wall." Ethan glanced toward the spot where the chest had been hidden, now neatly patched over. He could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken challenge in Adam's words. For a moment, he considered denying it, brushing off the question as if it were nothing. But something told him that Adam wouldn't let it go that easily. "I found some old stuff," Ethan admitted finally. A chest with some letters and photographs. Looked like it had been there for a long time. Adam nodded slowly, as if he had expected the answer. He took another step forward, his gaze locked on the spot where the chest had been. "What kind of letters?" Ethan hesitated. He wasn't sure how much to reveal, or if it was even his place to reveal anything at all. But there was a look in Adam's eyes, a kind of quiet desperation that made Ethan reconsider. This wasn't just a casual inquiry. Adam was searching for something, though Ethan couldn't tell what. "They were personal," Ethan said carefully. "Looked like they were from a woman in your family, a long time ago. She was writing to someone she cared about." Adam's jaw tightened. "And the photographs?" "They were of her and a man," Ethan said, "a black man." For a moment, Adam didn't say anything. His face was unreadable, his expression caught somewhere between anger and confusion. Ethan could see the gears turning in the boy's mind, trying to make sense of what he had just heard. Finally, Adam spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "Does my dad know?" "I haven't told anyone," Ethan replied. "I wasn't sure if it was something your family would want to know about." Adam let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "My dad doesn't want to know about anything that could mess with his perfect little world. He spends his whole life making sure we look like the perfect family, like we've got everything together. But the truth is, we're just like everyone else, maybe worse." Ethan didn't know how to respond to that. He could feel the weight of Adam's words, the frustration and resentment that had been building for years, threatening to spill over. It was a familiar story, one he had seen in other families, in other places, where the need to maintain appearances outweighed the truth. "Why do you care about this?" Ethan asked, his voice gentle. "About what I found?" Adam's eyes flashed with something like anger, but it wasn't directed at Ethan. "Because I'm tired of living a lie. I'm tired of pretending that we're some perfect family when we're not. And if there's a part of our history that my dad's trying to hide, then I want to know what it is." Ethan nodded slowly. He understood now. Adam wasn't just curious, he was searching for something real, something that would shatter the illusion his parents had built around them. And Ethan had just given him the key to that truth. But before either of them could say anything else, there was a noise from the top of the stairs. Ethan turned to see Mrs. Whittaker standing there, her face pale, her eyes wide with a mix of shock and fear. She had clearly heard more than she was supposed to. "What's going on down here?" she asked, her voice trembling. Adam glanced at his mother, then back at Ethan. There was a silent conversation between them, an understanding that passed in an instant. Ethan could feel the tension in the air thickening, the fragile threads of the family's secrets beginning to unravel right before his eyes. "Nothing," Adam said, his voice cold. "Just talking." Mrs. Whittaker didn't look convinced, but she didn't press the issue. Instead, she turned and walked back upstairs, her footsteps echoing through the house like the ticking of a clock, counting down to some inevitable confrontation. As she disappeared from view, Adam turned to Ethan once more. "Don't tell my dad, not yet." Ethan nodded, though he wasn't sure how long the secret would stay buried. The unraveling had already begun, and sooner or later, the truth would come out, whether the Whittakers were ready for it or not. The house felt different now. After the tense exchange with Adam in the basement, Ethan sensed a shift in the atmosphere of the Whittaker home. The once pristine, controlled environment now seemed fragile, like glass on the verge of shattering. The weight of the family's hidden history pressed down on everything, invisible but ever-present. Even the air felt thicker, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Ethan had come back one final time to check on the repairs, though he knew the real reason wasn't the plumbing anymore. He had been drawn into the unraveling of the Whittaker family, caught in the tide of their secrets. The chest with the letters and photographs had opened a door to the past, and now it seemed impossible to close it again. As he walked through the house, he could feel the tension hanging between the family members. Mrs. Whittaker moved around the house with nervous energy, her eyes darting from one thing to another, as if trying to find something to control in the chaos that was brewing beneath the surface. Mr. Whittaker was more distant than ever, buried in his work, barely acknowledging the tension around him. It was clear that he was trying to ignore whatever was happening, hoping that if he didn't acknowledge it, it would simply go away. But Adam was the storm on the horizon. Ethan had seen him a few times over the last few days, lurking around the house with a kind of restless energy. He was quieter than usual, but his silence spoke volumes. There was a fire burning inside him now, something raw and uncontainable. Ethan had given him the truth, or at least a piece of it, and now Adam was carrying that burden alone, waiting for the right moment to strike. It wasn't long before that moment came. One afternoon, while Ethan was finishing up his work in the basement, he heard raised voices upstairs. At first, he thought it was just another one of the family's minor disagreements, the kind of thing that happened in any household. But the voices grew louder, sharper. There was an edge to them that Ethan hadn't heard before. He climbed the stairs slowly, unsure if he should intervene or keep his distance. As he reached the top of the stairs, he could hear the argument clearly. It was Adam's voice, filled with anger and defiance, cutting through the air like a blade. "You've been lying to me my whole life," Adam shouted. "All of you. Pretending like we're perfect, like we're better than everyone else. But we're not, are we? We're just as messed up as the people you look down on." "Adam, calm down." Mrs. Whittaker's voice trembled, but she was trying to maintain control. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," Adam snapped. "You've been hiding things from me, from all of us, and I'm sick of it. I want the truth for once in my life." There was a pause, and then Ethan heard Mr. Whittaker's voice, low and commanding. "That's enough, Adam. You're not making any sense." "Oh, I'm making perfect sense," Adam shot back. "You've been hiding something about this family, about our past, and I'm not going to pretend like it doesn't exist just because it's inconvenient for you." Ethan stepped into the hallway, his heart pounding. He knew exactly what Adam was talking about. The letters, the photographs, the history that the Whittakers had buried long ago. It was all coming to the surface now, like a wound that had been festering in the dark, finally bursting open. In the living room, the scene was tense. Adam stood in the center of the room, his fists clenched at his sides, his face flushed with anger. Mr. Whittaker was seated in an armchair, his expression cold and unreadable, while Mrs. Whittaker stood nearby, her eyes wide with fear. Ethan wasn't sure if he should be there, but it was too late to leave unnoticed. Adam caught sight of him, and something in his face shifted, an unspoken invitation, a plea for backup. Ethan took a hesitant step forward, unsure of what to say, but knowing that silence wasn't an option anymore. "I found something," Adam said, his voice quieter now, but no less intense. "Down in the basement. Ethan found it." Mr. Whittaker's eyes flicked to Ethan, his expression hardening. "What is he talking about?" Ethan swallowed, the room suddenly feeling much smaller than it had before. He had never intended to be part of this confrontation, but there was no turning back now. He took a deep breath and met Mr. Whittaker's gaze. "I found an old chest hidden behind the wall," Ethan explained, his voice steady but careful. "It had letters and photographs from a long time ago." Mr. Whittaker's face remained impassive, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something like recognition, or maybe fear. Mrs. Whittaker's hand flew to her mouth and she turned away, as if trying to hide from the truth that was rapidly catching up to them. "I knew it," Adam said, his voice breaking the silence. "I knew there was something you weren't telling me." "There's nothing to know," Mr. Whittaker said coldly. "Whatever you found, it doesn't matter. It's the past." "The past matters," Adam said, his voice rising again. "It's part of who we are. You can't just bury it and pretend like it never happened." Mr. Whittaker stood up, his face a mask of control, but there was a crack in his composure. "We've built this family, this life, on certain principles. I won't let something from generations ago tear that down." "Principles?" Adam laughed bitterly. "You mean lies. You've been lying to all of us, to me, to Mom, to everyone." Mrs. Whittaker's shoulders shook and she sank into the nearest chair, her face buried in her hands. "I didn't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't know it was still there." Adam's expression softened as he looked at his mother, but the anger quickly returned when he turned back to his father. "You might be able to ignore it, but I can't. I won't." Mr. Whittaker crossed his arms, his face set in stone. "What do you want me to say? That my ancestors weren't perfect? That they made mistakes? Fine. But that doesn't change anything about who we are now." Adam shook his head. "It changes everything. You can't build a life on lies and expect it to hold up forever. Sooner or later, the truth comes out. And when it does, it destroys everything you tried to protect." The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan stood frozen, unsure of what to do or say. He had always been an outsider, a witness to the unraveling of this family's carefully constructed facade. But now, he was part of the story, whether he liked it or not. Finally, Mrs. Whittaker looked up, her eyes red and swollen. "What do we do now?" No one had an answer. The truth was out, but the cost of that truth remained unclear. The family stood at a crossroads, with the weight of their past hanging over them like a storm cloud, ready to break. Ethan could feel it in the air, the tension, the uncertainty, the fear of what would happen next. For the first time, the Whittakers were facing their own history, their own truth, and no one knew what would come of it. But one thing was certain, there was no going back. The past, once buried, had resurfaced, and now it demanded to be reckoned with. The weight of the truth hung in the air like a dense fog, refusing to lift, even as the confrontation in the Whittaker living room reached its uneasy conclusion. Ethan stood quietly, feeling like an intruder, in a moment that had stripped away every pretense the family had carefully constructed. He hadn't meant to disrupt their world, but the past had a way of surfacing when least expected, especially when it had been so carefully buried. Adam remained defiant, his chest rising and falling as he struggled to contain his emotions. His father, Mr. Whittaker, stood rigid, unwilling to yield any ground, clinging to his version of the family's legacy. And Mrs. Whittaker sat in her chair, broken and silent, as if the reality of their situation had hit her with a force she hadn't been prepared for. After a long, heavy pause, it was Ethan who finally spoke. "I'm sorry," he began, unsure of how his words would land. "I didn't mean to cause trouble for your family. I just found what was there." Mr. Whittaker's gaze was cold, his jaw tight. "It's not your fault," he said flatly, though it was clear he wasn't entirely convinced of his own words. "The past has a way of finding you, no matter how far you run from it." Adam stepped forward, his voice quiet but firm. "We're not running from it anymore. I won't let us." Mrs. Whittaker let out a soft sob, covering her face with her hands. "I just wanted us to be a family," she whispered, her words muffled by the weight of her shame. "I wanted everything to be perfect." "Mom," Adam said gently, kneeling beside her, We can still be a family, but we have to stop pretending. The truth in his words lingered in the room, echoing in the silence that followed. Ethan watched as Mrs. Whittaker's shoulders shook, her fragile composure crumbling under the pressure of a lifetime spent hiding from the past. She had been the one most invested in the family's image, the one who had worked tirelessly to maintain the illusion of perfection. But now that illusion was gone, shattered by the simple fact that the past could no longer be ignored. Mr. Whittaker, for all his stoicism, seemed lost. He stared at the floor, his arms still crossed, as if holding himself together through sheer force of will. "What do you expect us to do, Adam?" he asked finally, his voice low and weary. "How do we move forward from this?" Adam stood, his expression softening. "We start by acknowledging the truth. About who we are, about where we came from, and we stop hiding." Ethan could see the conflict in Mr. Whittaker's eyes. The man had spent his entire life building something he believed to be strong, solid, and untouchable. But now that foundation had cracks in it, cracks that couldn't be ignored any longer. "I don't want to hide anymore," Mrs. Whittaker said through her tears, her voice trembling. "I'm tired, so tired of pretending." Mr. Whittaker uncrossed his arms, letting them fall to his sides. He looked at his wife, at his son, and finally at Ethan. For the first time since the confrontation had begun, there was no anger or defensiveness in his eyes. Only a kind of resignation. The fight had drained out of him, and what remained was a man who had to come to terms with the fact that the world he had built wasn't as strong as he had once believed. "I didn't know about the letters," Mr. Whittaker admitted quietly. "I knew there were stories in the family, whispers about things from the past, but I never wanted to dig into it. I thought if we just focused on the present, on who we are now, it wouldn't matter." "But it does matter," Adam said, his voice gentle but insistent. "It's part of us, part of where we came from. Ignoring it doesn't make it go away." Mr. Whittaker sighed deeply, running a hand over his face. He looked older than Ethan had ever seen him, the weight of his decisions etched into the lines around his eyes. "What do we do now?" For a moment, no one spoke. The question hung in the air, unanswered. The Whittakers were at a crossroads, and the path forward was anything but clear. It was Mrs. Whittaker who spoke first, her voice still shaking but filled with a quiet determination. "We face it. Together." Adam nodded in agreement. "We don't have to pretend anymore. We can honor the past without letting it define us." Mr. Whittaker stared at his son for a long moment, the tension between them easing ever so slightly. There was no immediate resolution, no magical fix to the years of secrets and lies. But something had shifted, an understanding that the only way forward was through the truth, no matter how painful or uncomfortable it might be. Ethan, feeling the intensity of the moment, took a step back. This was their family's story, and though he had played a role in uncovering it, it wasn't his place to stay any longer. "I think my work here is done," he said quietly, gathering his tools. "I'll leave you to figure out the rest." Mrs. Whittaker looked up at him, her eyes still red but filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Ethan," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "for everything." He nodded, offering a small smile. "Take care of yourselves." As he turned to leave, he felt a hand on his arm. It was Adam. The young man's face was a mix of emotions, gratitude, sorrow, and something that looked like hope. "I'm sorry you got dragged into all of this," Adam said softly. "But I'm glad you found the letters. I don't think we could have faced this without it." Ethan gave him a reassuring nod. "Sometimes the truth has a way of coming out, whether we're ready for it or not. I'm just glad you're ready to face it now." Adam let go of his arm, and Ethan left the house, stepping out into the crisp afternoon air. The sun was shining, but the house behind him felt like it was still shrouded in shadows, shadows that had been cast by years of secrecy and shame. As he drove away, Ethan couldn't help but think about the couple in the letters, their love hidden away for so many years. The past had finally been unearthed, and though it had brought pain, it had also brought a chance for healing. The Whittakers would have to face their history, but maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to move forward together. In the end, it wasn't just about the letters or the photographs. It was about the truth that had been buried for so long but could no longer be ignored. The Whittakers had a long road ahead of them, but they had taken the first step. They had chosen to stop running from the past and instead to face it head-on. And that, Ethan realized, was how healing began. As the weeks passed, Ethan occasionally thought about the Whittakers. He wondered how they were coping, how the conversation about their past had unfolded in the days after he left. He had no doubt that they still had their struggles, but something told him that Adam's determination would see them through. The young man had been the catalyst for change, and with his family now confronting the truth, there was hope for something better, a future built not on illusions, but on honesty and acceptance. Ethan smiled to himself as he pulled into the driveway of his next job. Life had a funny way of bringing unexpected lessons, even through the cracks in the walls of an old house. As he grabbed his tools and prepared for the day's work, he knew that, no matter what challenges lay ahead, facing them with truth and integrity was the only way forward. It wasn't always easy, but it was the only way to truly heal. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.